Imagine a party. At first, everyone is calm. The music plays softly. People chat, drink in moderation, enjoy themselves quietly. But as the night goes on, someone turns up the music. Someone opens another bottle. Someone else climbs on a table. The energy builds. The party spins out of control. And just when the euphoria seems like it cannot go any higher, someone calls the police. The party is over. The lights come on. And everyone sees the damage. Economies work exactly like this. Periods of euphoria followed by painful falls. Booms and recessions. Expansions and contractions. And at the center of everything, a force that amplifies every upswing and every downturn. That force is debt. Today we are going to understand the machine that drives economic cycles. A machine built with debt. We have talked about interest, inflation, deflation, and hyperinflation. All of these phenomena are connected by a common thread: debt. Debt is neither good nor bad in itself. It is a tool. It allows a family to buy a home they would take decades to pay for in cash. It allows a business to invest today in order to grow tomorrow. It allows a government to finance a road or a hospital. But when debt grows too much, too fast, for too long, it becomes something dangerous. And understanding how it accumulates and how it unravels is understanding why economies have cycles. Today we are going to see two theoretical frameworks that explain the debt machine. The first is from Ray Dalio, an investor who turned it into a practical model. The second is from Hyman Minsky, an economist who was ignored in his lifetime and vindicated by history. Ray Dalio is the founder of Bridgewater Associates, one of the largest investment funds in the world. In 2013 he published a video called How the Economic Machine Works that has been viewed hundreds of millions of times. And his model, though simplified, is extraordinarily useful for understanding cycles. Dalio says the economy has three main forces. The first is productivity growth. In the long run, economies grow because people learn to produce more with less. Better technology, better education, better organization. This force is stable and predictable. It is the trend line. The second force is the short-term debt cycle. It lasts between 5 and 8 years. And it works like this. When the economy is doing well, people have stable incomes. Banks are willing to lend. Borrowers are willing to take on debt. Credit flows. People spend more than they earn because they can borrow the difference. That extra spending feeds more income for others, who in turn spend more. But credit is not free money. It has to be repaid. And a point comes when accumulated debt starts to weigh. People devote more of their income to paying debt and less to spending. Spending falls. Other people's incomes fall. Banks tighten credit conditions. And the economy contracts. The central bank lowers interest rates. Credit becomes cheaper. People start borrowing again. And the cycle restarts. This is what you see in the newspapers every few years. Expansion, recession, recovery, expansion. It is the heartbeat of the economy. And credit is the heart that pumps. But Dalio does not stop there. He says there is a second cycle, much longer, of 75 to 100 years. The long-term debt cycle. It works like this. Each time the economy recovers from a short-term recession, it does so with a little more debt than the time before. Rates fall, people borrow more. When they rise, the contraction is more severe because there is more debt. But the central bank lowers rates even further. And the next cycle accumulates even more debt. Over time, the economy's total debt grows much faster than income. Interest rates gradually decline. Until one day they reach zero. And then the central bank runs out of ammunition. That is the end of the long cycle. And it is exactly what happened in 2008. After decades of rising debt and falling rates, the American economy hit a wall. Rates reached zero. Debt was enormous. And the main tool, cutting rates, could no longer be used. Dalio calls what follows a deleveraging. A painful process where the economy has to reduce its debt burden. And there are 4 ways to do it. The first is austerity. Spending less, paying down debt. It works at the individual level, but at the collective level it can be counterproductive. If everyone cuts at the same time, the economy sinks. The second is default. Bankruptcies, restructurings, debt that simply is not paid. Painful for creditors, but it frees debtors. The third is redistribution. Transfers from those who have more to those who owe more. Higher taxes. Relief programs. The fourth is printing money. The central bank creates new money to offset the destruction of credit. This is what the Federal Reserve, the ECB, and the Bank of Japan did with quantitative easing after 2008. Dalio says a beautiful deleveraging is one that combines all 4 tools in the right proportion. Enough austerity to be credible, but not so much that it destroys the economy. Enough money printing to offset deflation, but not so much that it generates inflation. It is an extraordinarily delicate balance. The second theoretical framework comes from an economist who for decades was virtually unknown. Hyman Minsky taught at Washington University in St. Louis. He did not publish in the most prestigious journals. He did not win important prizes. And his ideas were largely ignored by the mainstream. Until 2008. When everything he had predicted came true. Minsky's central idea is summarized in a paradoxical phrase: stability breeds instability. It works like this. When an economy has been running well for years, people begin to forget that crises exist. Banks relax their lending standards. Investors take on more risk. Regulators look the other way. Why worry? Everything is fine. And it is precisely that excess of confidence that sows the seeds of the next crisis. Minsky classified borrowers into three categories. And their names are revealing. The first type is the hedge borrower. The most conservative. Their current income is sufficient to pay both the interest and the principal on their debt. They do not depend on things going well. They can pay no matter what. The second type is the speculative borrower. Their income covers the interest on their debt, but not the principal. They need to refinance periodically. They need banks to remain willing to lend so they can roll over their debt when it matures. If credit dries up, they have a problem. The third type is the Ponzi borrower. The name comes from Charles Ponzi, the swindler who gave his name to pyramid schemes. The Ponzi borrower cannot pay either the interest or the principal from their current income. They stay afloat only because the value of their assets is rising. If your business does not generate enough to pay the mortgage, but you are not worried because the value of the property rises every year and you can refinance against that rising value, you are a Ponzi borrower according to Minsky. You are not necessarily a swindler. You simply depend on prices continuing to rise. And when they stop rising, it is over. What Minsky observed is that, during periods of stability, the proportion of Ponzi borrowers in the economy gradually increases. Banks lend more easily. Borrowers take on more risk. Asset prices rise, which seems to justify the gamble. Until it stops working. Some event, a rate increase, a fall in asset prices, a change in sentiment reveals that Ponzi borrowers cannot pay. They start selling assets to cover their debts. The mass selling drives prices down. Speculative borrowers, who depended on refinancing, discover that banks no longer want to lend. And what started as a problem for a few becomes a systemic panic. This tipping point is called the Minsky moment. The 2008 crisis was a textbook Minsky moment. For years, American banks had granted mortgages to people who could not pay them, the famous subprime loans. Those borrowers were pure Ponzi borrowers. They could only pay if their house prices kept rising. When prices stopped rising and began to fall, the entire system collapsed. Minsky did not live to see the 2008 crisis. He died in 1996. But his hypothesis became so famous after the crisis that the term Minsky moment entered the global financial vocabulary. What is fascinating is comparing how different countries managed the end of the long cycle. Japan, after its bubble burst in 1990, took too long to recognize the magnitude of the problem. Banks hid their non-performing loans for years. The government did not act decisively enough. And the result was 3 decades of stagnation. The United States, after the 2008 crisis, acted faster and more aggressively. The Federal Reserve cut rates to zero almost immediately and launched massive quantitative easing programs. The government approved a fiscal stimulus package. And it forced banks to recognize their losses and recapitalize. The result was a faster recovery, though not without pain. Unemployment reached 10%, millions of families lost their homes. But the American economy climbed out of the hole in a few years, not decades. Both cases illustrate Dalio's machine in action. And both confirm Minsky's hypothesis. The stability of the preceding decades generated the overconfidence that fed the bubble. An alternative view deserves mention. The Austrian School of Economics, represented by economists like Friedrich Hayek and Ludwig von Mises, has a different explanation of debt cycles. For the Austrians, the problem is not human nature or the tendency towards excess. The problem is the manipulation of interest rates by central banks. When a central bank keeps rates artificially low, it sends a false signal to the economy. It says there is more savings available than actually exists. Businesses invest in projects that are not profitable at real rates. And when reality catches up, those investments fail. From this perspective, debt cycles are not an inherent disease of capitalism. They are a consequence of government intervention in the money market. It is a legitimate view, with serious arguments. It is not the dominant one in current academia, but it has gained followers after every crisis. And the debate between Minsky's view instability is endogenous to the system and the Austrian view instability is caused by intervention remains open. Debt cycles are not an abstract phenomenon that only affects banks and markets. They affect real families. When the debt machine expands, families borrow to buy homes, cars, education. Everything seems fine. Prices rise. Jobs are plentiful. The future looks bright. When the machine contracts, those same families find themselves with debts they cannot pay, jobs that disappear, and assets worth less than what they owe. It is what is called being underwater, owing more on your house than it is worth. And the cruel thing about the cycle is that decisions that seemed perfectly reasonable at the time, buying a house when everyone was buying, taking a loan when the bank was offering one, turn out to be traps when the cycle turns. Understanding the debt machine does not guarantee avoiding its effects. But at least it helps you not mistake a good economic moment for a permanent law of nature. 3 ideas to take away from this episode. First, the economy moves in debt cycles. Ray Dalio distinguishes a short cycle of 5 to 8 years, driven by the expansion and contraction of credit, and a long cycle of 75 to 100 years, in which debt accumulates until interest rates reach zero and the system needs a reset. Second, Hyman Minsky showed that stability breeds instability. In good times, borrowers shift from prudent to speculative and from speculative to insolvent. The Minsky moment is the point at which the bubble bursts. Third, the way an economy manages its deleveraging determines its future. Japan took 3 decades. The United States, a few years. The combination of austerity, defaults, redistribution and money printing makes the difference. Debt cycles move economies. But debt is more than an economic mechanism. It is one of the oldest moral questions in human civilization. Is it a sin to go into debt? Is it unfair to charge interest? Should a country forgive its citizens' debts? The answer depends on whom you ask. And when. That, next time.